about the Pew Research Center's work on Muslims in the United States. We did a survey in 2017, so we finished up about 6 months ago, looking at the views and attitudes of the U.S. Muslim communities, how they see themselves generally fitting into American society, and how Muslims are dealing with the current political climate. And also a lot of information about sort of demographics, how many Muslims are they, what are their economic situations, what are their, how many of them are U.S. born, foreign born, all these sorts of things. So what I'm going to highlight in this presentation is twofold. First, I'm going to show some data that highlights the really important point that this sort of survey data is good at, which is that the Muslim communities in the U.S. are very diverse. We can't really speak about the Muslim community as if it's a single block and they're all the same. And so Muslims think this and Muslims do this. We really can't really talk about that very effectively. So I'm going to highlight some of the diversity of Muslims across religiosity, across ethnicity, all these different variations. And then I'm going to talk about some of the patterns that do emerge across different groups of Muslims and how they compare to other religious groups on a variety of things. For example, in the current political climate, we see an interesting tension that on the one hand, Muslims will tell us that they feel that things are very difficult for them. They feel discrimination. Discrimination is actually on the rise. There's a lot of frustration with the current administration. On the other hand, nearly all Muslims say that they're proud to be American. Muslims tend to be more invested in and believe more in the idea that if you work hard in this country, you can get ahead than does even the larger public overall. So there's an interesting tension there. And so I'm going to highlight some of that tension as we talk. So, first of all, we're going to talk about Muslims and the pattern I want to dispel, which is that you can just tell who's Muslim and who's not by looking. This is actually a pretty common myth, as it turns out. Most people think, you look at someone, you can tell. I'll know if I see a Muslim. That's a Muslim. That's not a Muslim. That woman, she's not covering her hair. She must not be Muslim. People think that they can do that. The data tells us that's not the case. It tells us that most Muslims don't have anything distinctive about them, about their appearance, about their clothing, about their dress, that identifies them as Muslim. It turns out that women are a bit more likely than men. Muslim women are a bit more likely than Muslim men to say they feel like they are distinguishable, in part because Muslim women often do wear the hijab, the headscarf. But it's still only about half of Muslim women that are identifiable in this way. And it's not the case that this is a pattern among U.S. born versus foreign born, where you can find all the foreign-born Muslims, but not the ones who are born in the U.S., or all the U.S.-born Muslims, but not the ones that are born overseas. There's some variety there as well. And part of the reason why we see that is something like the hijab. It turns out that that's not a pattern that's unique to immigrant Muslims. U.S.-born Muslim women are, if anything, more likely to decide to cover their hair in this country than are immigrant Muslim women. So this idea that this is, a foreign religion that's easily found out, and you can sort of single them out by looking, it turns out the data makes it clear that's just not the case. In terms of the U.S. born versus foreign born, a little more than half, 58% of Muslim adults say that they were born in another country, and I'll talk some more about what countries those are from. Another 18% say that they were born in the United States, but their parents were born in another country. And about 1 in 4 U.S. Muslims, their families have been in this country for many generations. Often these people are either converts, or the children of converts, maybe even the grandchildren of converts. So there's a mix here of people who have come from overseas fairly recently, and people who have long established roots in this country. In terms of, there's also a great deal of diversity in terms of race or ethnicity, in terms of countries that immigrants are coming from. So about 20% of U.S. Muslims are South Asian, So, coming from countries like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. About 14%, about 1 in 7 are coming from the Middle East or North Africa, so like Arabs, broadly speaking. This is only about 1 in 7, so it's not the case that all Muslims are Arab, or most Muslims are Arab, or even the plurality of Muslims are Arab. It's only about 14% of Muslims are Arab. Incidentally, the reverse is also true. Most Arabs are not Muslim. Most Arabs in this country are actually Christian. So it's neither the case that Arabs are all Muslim or that Muslims are all Arab. So 13% come from other countries in the Asia Pacific. About 5% of U.S. Muslims are from sub-Saharan Africa. And then among the U.S. born, so among the U.S. born population of Muslims, about 1 in 7 identify as white. This includes Caucasians from Europe, etc., that are not immigrants, but have been there for multiple generations. But also includes second and third generation Arabs, Iranians, all of those generally identify as white, or are classified as white. About 1 in 7 U.S. Muslims are African Americans, so U.S. born and identifying as black. And you can see here or over here for some of these other groups. So smaller percentages are identify as Asian or a mix of variety of races. As I'm going through, incidentally, if you have questions about any of these slides, feel free to stop me. We'll also have time for question and answer at the end, but if there's something specific to a slide, I'm happy to sort of pause along the line.
I think I went on a slide. I was just reading the history of slavery, and there's Africans who came way back.
Oh, yes.
Who were Muslims.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was just wondering, that's probably such a small group that doesn't really show up.
So there's an interesting history there. That there absolutely is the case, both sort of circumstantially looking at the countries that Africans were brought to the United States from, and also we see documented cases. There are a number of Africans that got their freedom. That there are remnants of Quran and written in Arabic, etc. So we have lots of documentation that some of the earliest people that came to the United States were enslaved African Muslims. But it's also the case that the enslaved peoples that were brought to this country had a very difficult time maintaining their religion. The slavery sort of institution in this country worked really hard to make sure to break bonds. So to break bonds of religion, to break bonds of family, to break bonds of community. And so there weren't very many people who came here who maintained the religion that they had back home. So to your point, it's not the case that many African Americans in this country trace their Islam back to the 16th century, back to the 17th century, even though we know that there were African Muslims here at that time. It's much more likely that you'd see people that trace their Islam back to the 1960s, the 1970s. There was a pretty sizable wave of conversion, first to the Nation of Islam and other organizations like that, and then into Sunni organizations through that period.
Actually, Muslim being in America says 889.
889.
In the 9th century. And then in 1235, Shanghai Empire had a diplomatic relation with Indians.
Mm-hmm. So there's evidence of even earlier, sort of before there was in America, that there were people who have come to this country.
Also, everybody might have seen that LCD rules, and most of those slaves came from Gambia. In fact, in the Route 2, Earl Jones goes back to Gambia to do the research. And Gambia is almost a Muslim majority country. It was and it is.
So as I said, there were definitely some people that have come. But there's also diversity. So we talk about racial diversity, ethnic diversity, country diversity. There's also religious diversity among Muslims. So it's not the case that everyone who identifies as Muslim is very religious. There are people, just like there are within Christianity, there are people who identify as Muslim and their religion sits rather lightly for them. And there are people who identify as Muslim and it's their foremost identity. And so we asked the question of people, we said, how important is religion in your life? Is it very important, somewhat important, not too important, and not at all important? And what we see is about 2/3 of Muslims say that religion is very important in their lives, which is about the same as what we see among Christians in this country. Incidentally, it's significantly higher than we see among Jews in this country. But Muslims and Christians are about equally likely to say religion is very important in their lives. And there's quite a few who don't see that, who say it's somewhat important, not too important, or not important at all. They still identify as Muslim, but that's not sort of the foremost part of their identity. And even going beyond religiosity broadly, when we ask the question about what does this mean? What does it mean to be religious Muslim? So we asked a question about, do you believe there's more than one true way to interpret the teachings of Islam? And it turned out that most Muslims in this country say that they believe there's more than one true way to interpret the teaching of Islam. There's more than one correct way to be Muslim. So we don't see a lot of Muslims saying, you have to follow this exact way. If you do any other deviation, you're doing something wrong. This is bid'ah, this is a sin. We don't see a lot of that. Most Muslims, even most Muslims who say religion is very important in their lives, that's an important point. So among Muslims who say religion is very important in their lives, it's still the case that 59% say that there's more than one true interpretation of Islam. So even people who say religion is very important, Muslims who say religion is very important, are not saying that my way is the only way to be Muslim. They're just saying that it's important. And again, this is similar to what we see among Christians in the United States. Many Christians also believe there's more than one correct way to be Christian, more than one true way to follow the teachings of their religion. So what does this mean? What does it mean for there to be more than one true way to interpret the teachings of Islam? Well, we asked Muslims, what do you say is, what are the essential parts of what being Muslim means to you? And we gave them this list, and we asked them, for each of them, would you say this is essential to being Muslim? Or would you say it's important but not essential? Or would you say it's not important? And what we see, obviously, as you expect, most Muslims say believing in God is essential to what being Muslim means. Loving the Prophet Muhammad is also something that most Muslims say is essential. But also, we see really high up there working for justice and equality, working to protect the environment. In fact, those two are as high, or maybe even higher, than following the Quran and Sunnah. So this idea of Islam as being sort of sensitive to the environment, sensitive to social justice concerns, is very prevalent among Muslims. And then sort of later lower down we have things like eating lawfully, dressing modestly, even on the sort of most fundamental point, arguably, of Islam, sort of one of the core distinctive practices, the daily prayers, the daily salah. Traditionally, Muslims are going to pray 5 times a day. Only about half of Muslims in the United States say that they pray 5 times a day. Others say they pray at least once a day or less often than that. About 8%, so about 1 in 10 Muslims in the United States say that they never pray. That's just not a practice that they engage in. They still identify as Muslim, but they don't feel like this is a practice that they need to engage in order to sort of validate their identity.
I have a question on that. I know that when we do surveys among Christians, and we ask how many times they go to church, and they tend to exaggerate how many times they go to church. So I was wondering if this survey, do you think there's any kind of exaggeration there?
You're about to get beat up. I see it in front row. So we also asked, that's a good question actually. We also just incidentally asked Muslims about going to the mosque. And we see about half of Muslims say they go to the mosque at least once a week. But for these sorts of questions about how often do you pray, how often do you go to the mosque, how often you go to church, It is the case that what people report usually doesn't line up with, if you sort of do a count of cars at the churches, do a count of, a head count at the mosque, you sort of go to someone's house and knock on their door to return time, are they there or not? It doesn't line up. So that is true, and that's true for this as it is for Christians. I would say, though, that the way to interpret this is not to think of it as sort of people exaggerating, but it's how people present themselves. It's how they think of themselves. So there are lots of people who will say, I'm the sort of person that prays 5 times a day. Did you make all your prayers today? Well, today there was a thing, there was a meeting, I wasn't quite able to get out. I'm the sort of person that goes to Jummah prayer every week. But this week there was a thing and I couldn't get out of it, but I'll do it next week. So it's this sort of person who thinks of themselves. They think that this is an important practice to them, whether or not they execute consistently. And so that's really what people are usually reporting is, are you the sort of person that thinks of themselves as, are you the sort of person that thinks of yourself as someone who attends mosque or church regularly? Now, when we want to ask, we didn't in this question, but there are occasionally, as survey done, we don't really want to know, do you think of yourself as the sort of person who, we want to, did you do it? And there are slightly different sets of questions we can ask. If we really want to, we ask questions like, last week, did you go? Earlier today, did you pray? So we can ask these more focused questions if what we really want to know is, are people executing? But with these questions that we typically ask, again, is not, are you executing, but do you think of yourself? Is this an identity that's important to you? So I've spent a lot of time telling you all things that we can't say about Muslims. We can't make any generalizations because they're so varied. One thing that we can tell you about is how many Muslims there are. So we can do that. Although I will warn you, and we can talk about this in the Q&A if people are interested, I will warn you that there are other groups that dispute the numbers. Which is not unique to Muslims. We see this for all religious groups. There are always, other people who are doing counts are like, no, your number's wrong because of this or that or whatever. And that's fine. But we feel fairly confident that there are now about 3.5 million Muslims in the United States, which makes Muslims slightly larger than 1% of the United States population. They're the 3rd largest religious group. If you treat Christians as a single religious group, it would be Christians, Jews, and Muslims in the order of size. And if we do projections in terms of the patterns we see of growth in religious groups, etc., we expect that in the next 25 years or so, the relationship between Jews and Muslims will flip. So that there'll be more Muslims than Jews in the United States. That's what our projections suggest, that by about 2040, give or take, there'll be more Muslims than Jews.
Yeah, how did you come up with this with number 3.45 million? What was the source? In the U.S. Census Bureau, religion is not
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
So tell me the source, because I totally disagree with your number.
Okay.
And 2 years ago or 3 years ago, Pew Research gave a reason, and I could not find the telephone number. They said 1.2 million.
No.
3 years ago.
I was at Pew 2 years ago. We said, what we did say is we said that the number, 2 years ago, I actually wrote the post 2 years ago.
3 years ago. Maybe.
I wrote a post on how many Muslims there were 2 years ago, and we said there were 3.1 or 3.2 was our number. But to get to your broader point of how do we do this, because you are correct, the Census Bureau does not answer, right? So for things like race, how many African Americans are there in this country, how many millennials are there in this country, how many immigrants are there in this country, the Census Bureau is how you find the answer to these questions. Because it's imperfect, even the Census Bureau is imperfect, but the Census Bureau is far and away the best data that we have on all of those sorts of things. But they don't ask, they don't ask religion. It's a matter of sort of government policy going back for a long time. The Census Bureau doesn't answer religion. So the way that we calculate it, since we can't do that, is we use our survey data. So there's two ways that we calculate it. This particular number, the way we calculate it, is we started with our survey data. So we did this survey of Muslims in the United States. We called a variety of about 100,000 people. We spoke to about 100,000 people across the country, randomly selected, and we said, out of that 100,000, what share of these people are Muslim? And we can then look within that information and sort of break it down by subgroups. So what share of the people who identify as Arab are Muslim? What share of the people who identify as African American are Muslim? What share of the people under 40 are Muslim? So we look at the share of people that are Muslim across these various different categories using our survey. And then we go to the Census Bureau and say, well, how many people are in that category? So, and I'm going to just make these numbers up because I don't remember the exact numbers. But if, for example, we were to find out that 3% of African Americans are Muslim, and we were to find out that there were 500 million African Americans in the country, then we would say, okay, well, 3% of 50 million, 3% of 50 million, that's how many African American Muslims there are. And we do that same pattern for each group. We say, well, how many Arab Muslims are there? Well, how many people did we talk to that said that they were Arab and said they were Muslim? Okay, well, how many Arabs are there in the country? And so we do that for each group to get up to the full population of the United States. And then we compare, and then we add that up to figure out the full population of Muslims in the United States. And so we wind up with, in this case, 3.5 million Muslims.
Still, I'd like to have this discussion.
If we want to have a discussion, I think we should wait to question and answer. If you have a question about the slide, I'm happy to cover it, but I don't want to get into a discussion.
No, not discussion. I'm just giving you some information. 14, 15 years ago, I used to subscribe a Time magazine. One lady at Harvard, she wrote that there are approximately 8 to 9 million Muslims.
She was wrong.
Yeah, I remember. Sir, I have kept that part. Okay, there are 16 million.
14. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this.
Yeah.
No, this is a very important thing.
It's very important, yes, but I'd like to go through my other slides as well. I think some of them are also very important. So after I finish my presentation, we can spend the whole question and answer talking about population numbers. I don't mind. But I'd like to go through your slides. So, other patterns that we see among Muslims in the United States. We see that, as I mentioned before, many Muslims feel that uncomfortable, uncertain about their place in this country. About 3/4 say that there's a lot of discrimination against Muslims in the United States. 2/3 say that Donald Trump makes them feel worried. About 62%, so about 2/3 say that they don't think the American people see Islam as mainstream. So by these measures, a lot of Muslims, most Muslims, are saying that they don't feel quite comfortable in this country. They don't feel like they're being fully accepted, being fully welcome. I have some other data that I can talk about later in the questionnaire in terms of people, if people are interested, about what does the public actually think. It turns out that the public also recognizes that Muslims face a lot of discrimination, and a lot of the public actually doesn't think Islam is mainstream. So this is not completely crazy. When we ask the public overall, do you consider Islam as part of mainstream American society or not, about half of the public says no. So I've got some other slides that go into that if we have some time. But suffice it to say that this is what Muslims are feeling, and our data says that they're not crazy. Experiences with discrimination. And this is not just sort of, do you think there's a lot of discrimination, but have you personally experienced discrimination in the last year? We've asked that question 3 times over the 3 times that we've done this survey, and we've seen increasing shares of Muslims saying that they've personally experienced discrimination in the past year. So, more discrimination over the last few years. And this is also in line with data that we've just done some analysis of the FBI data for 2014 15 that recently came out, and it also showed a sharp rise in the share of Muslims or the number of Muslims who are saying they've experienced hate crimes. So there's definitely increases in Muslims saying that they feel like they've experienced discrimination. Is there another? On the other hand, so that's the bad news. On the other hand, increasing shares of Muslims also say that someone has expressed support for them because of their religion. So when we first asked this question, in 2007, a third of Muslims said someone had expressed support for them because they were Muslim. And it's now the case that half of Muslims say they've had this experience. In the past year, someone has expressed support for them because they're Muslim. So discrimination is on the rise, but so is support. It's also the case that, despite the increasing discrimination, despite the uncertainty of their place in the country, 92% of Muslims say that they're proud to be American. 80% of Muslims say they're satisfied with the way things are going in their lives. And 70% of Muslims say that people can get ahead in this country if they work hard. Interesting point about this that I alluded to earlier, Muslims are more likely than non-Muslims to believe that if you work hard in this country, you can get ahead. So despite these experiences of discrimination, etc., Muslims, by and large, are very committed to and believe in the American ideals and this American dream. Muslims also share the public's concern about extremism. So Muslims are actually more likely than the public overall to say that they're very concerned about extremism in the name of Islam around the world. 2/3 of Muslims say they're very concerned about extremism in the name of Islam around the world. Only about half of the public overall says this. So they're more concerned about international extremism in the name of Islam. And they're at least as concerned, if anything more concerned here as well, about the possibility of there being extremism in the name of Islam in the United States. So Muslims share the public's concerns about extremism. Asking more specifically, we asked a question about violence against civilian targets. Do you think that targeting violence targeting civilians can be justified for any reason? Turns out Muslims are more likely than non-Muslims in this country to say that this sort of violence can never be justified. So they're more opposed to violence against civilians in the large public. And we actually, in this question, we followed up with people who said that it can sometimes be justified, and we asked a question about, well, what did you mean by that? In the Q&A, we can spend some time talking about those, what do people mean when they said this? Because, as you might be able to guess, if it's the case that, 4 in 10 Americans think that violence against civilians can at least sometimes be justified, they're talking about something other than, strapping a bomb to themselves on the wall or something. I don't think anyone believes that 4 in 10 Americans are ready to do something like that. So we did ask the question of what do they mean. We can spend some time in the Q&A exploring that.
So this violence by individuals or by state?
The question wording exactly like this. Some people think targeting and killing civilians can be justified in order to further a political, social, or religious cause. Other people believe that no matter what the reason, this kind of violence can never be justified. So we didn't specify whether it was by state or by individuals. We left that open to people's interpretation. And as you're picking up on, when we probe a little bit, one of the patterns we saw is this question of by states, by individuals. So for example, people, just quickly I'll mention, some people mentioned something like the bombing of Hiroshima as violence against civilians that was justified. So sometimes what they're talking about is violence by the state. So Muslims share the public's concerns about extremism, but they feel singled out by the government's anti-terrorism work. So for example, 59% of Muslims say they're that they think it's either very or at least somewhat likely that the government is monitoring their calls or emails. So Muslims feel like the government is watching them. And about 1 in 5 Muslims say that they've personally been stopped by airport security in the past year because they're Muslim. Which probably feeds into this idea that they're being watched. Similarly, we asked the question, and this question is a little tricky, so I'm going to take a minute. We asked Muslims a question about government sting operations, and whether they think that when people get sort of arrested on the basis of these sorts of things, if the people that were arrested are violent people who pose a real threat, or they were people who were tricked by law enforcement and otherwise would not have posed a real threat. So we wanted to get at this issue of, do you think that these operations are really making the country safer? Or are they just getting people who otherwise would just be going around their lives and sort of entrapping them? And it turns out Muslims are pretty divided on this question, on how effective these sorts of practices are in getting real threats off the streets, as opposed to, just getting people who are naive and will agree to they're asked something, they say, oh yeah, sure, I'll do that, and then they would never have actually done it if it weren't like an FBI agent who was encouraging them or something like that. So Muslims are very wary about whether or not this is happening, and whether or not it's reliable. Turns out the public has some reservations about this as well, although not as extensive. About one in five Americans believe that these sorts of government sting operations are capturing people who otherwise would not have been posing a threat to the country. So, and I'll make this point and then I'll stop here so we've got plenty of time for questions. One other question that we asked Muslims was, what do they think about media coverage of Islam and Muslims in this country? Do they think that media coverage is fair, or do they think media coverage is unfair? It turns out that most Muslims, 60%, believe that media coverage of Islam and Muslims in this country is unfair. 27% believe it's fair, and 13% say it's sort of more complicated. It depends on what station you're talking about, or something like that. Turns out that the plurality of the larger public actually also says media coverage of Islam and Muslims is unfair. So 53% of the larger public, the non-Muslim public, also says that media coverage of Islam and Muslims in this country is unfair. And so I think in the perception of many Muslims, this pattern of how the media is covering Islam and Muslims is linked to some of the negative views that much of the public has toward Islam and toward Muslims. So I'm going to stop here, as I said, to leave plenty of time for questions and answers. For some of the questions, I may go on to some additional slides, but